Hey, welcome back. Today's video is about what to do with that brass after you're done fireforming it. You know, I shoot practice with my brass. I shoot inconsequential matches with brass in order to get it fireformed. Once it's been fireformed in the chamber that it's going to live its life in, we have to then size it the first time. And that's what this video is about, is how to size it properly that first time so that we get the best possible outcome from the brass on the second firing when we're likely to be doing load development and initial load validation during more consequential matches. In order to do this, we have to make a few assumptions. The first assumption we have to make is this is a new barrel, cartridge, chamber, something of that nature that you don't know the exact internal dimensions of the chamber. That's important because if you have a barrel that you already know what the correct sizing is for, you can just go to that sizing. You don't have to do this process. In other words, with my 284 barrels that are literally all the same, when I go to size them, I use the same competition shell holder and same die every single time, and I get the same result over and over again. It works for me every time it's tried and never varies. But in this case, I have a 223 Remington. It's a new barrel that was head spaced with a nut. In other words, we don't know exactly what that headspace dimension is. Speaking of headspace dimensions, let's define a couple of them here. The first is the term headspace. Now, in this case, I'm going to use the term headspace solely to describe the distance from the bolt face to the shoulder datum of the chamber. This is a chamber dimension, nothing else. The brass does not have headspace for the purposes of this video. It may in other videos, but not in this one. The second term I really want you to understand is the idea of head clearance. Head clearance is a difference between the brass dimension, you know, the sized brass dimension, and the headspace. That air gap between the brass and the chamber when you chamber around prior to firing it. This is the dimension that we are actually trying to control when we're sizing brass. And it's somewhat critical to the success of what we're doing. We start getting large variations in that dimension, and we're going to start getting variations in velocity spreads and accuracy, precision from our rifle, and neither of which is something we desire to do. So we want to keep those dimensions as consistent as possible. You notice I didn't say a specific dimension. Consistency is key here. Now, we're going to get into some considerations as we go a little further, but for now, let's just focus on consistency. Once again, this is a brand new chamber, brand new barrel with a nut for headspace. So we have no idea what our headspace dimension is in our chamber at this moment. We're going to find out while we're doing this process, and then we're going to size based on what the headspace dimension of the chamber is in order to control the head clearance to the desired value. In this case, my desired value is 2 thousandths of an inch head clearance. You might think, just bump the shoulder 2 thousandths and you're there. Well, that'd be fine if the brass actually fit the chamber after the first firing, but you're about to see that it doesn't. So let's get into the shop here and take a look at what I got for brass after that first firing with this brand new Starline brass. In order to do this, we have to do a little bit of work to the rifle because there are two measuring tools required to do this. One is the rifle. The other one is your comparator on your calipers, just like everybody uses. The problem with using just a comparator and not the rifle is you have no idea what you're measuring from with a comparator. In other words, how big is that dimension that is the biggest that is allowed for the chamber in order to chamber? If you don't know that, you really can't be bumping a reasonable amount knowingly. You're not knowledgeable about where you're coming from in order to determine where you're going to. You have to let the brass fit the chamber at some point, and that is kind of critical. Now, I picked 3 random pieces of brass out of the bag here and popped the primers out because the primers tend to have a little bit of distortion on them that causes the comparator gauge to not seat fully against the case head. It creates an air gap, and that air gap, well, that messes up your dimensions and your measurements. So we want to eliminate that by removing the primer. Now, I didn't size the cases at all in the process of removing the primers. I just used a decapping die. Once we've got them decapped, let's just go ahead and check them in the chamber. But in order to do that, we have to take the bolt apart. First thing we're going to do is we're going to take the firing pin and spring assembly out of the bolt. This is critical to eliminate as much friction as possible in the bolt so that it falls closed easily. The second thing we have to do is remove any spring-loaded ejectors that are in the bolt. In this case, it's a Remington 700, so we got to pull that spring-loaded ejector out. I can't show you this on YouTube. If you don't know how to do it, you're going to have to go figure out how to do that. There's other videos out there for that. Just be forewarned, if you're going to be taking this apart for the first time, make sure you have containment for your small parts because that roll pin is tiny, as is the ejector plunger. And if it falls off the bench and you have to wait several days to get a new one, you're not going to be very happy. With all that taken care of in a stripped bolt, let's go ahead and put the bolt back in the rifle. So our 3 cases that we have here, we're just going to start putting them in the chamber one at a time and seeing if one fits better than the other 2. I'm doing this for demonstration purposes because there's something here that I want to show you, but we'll get to that. The first one goes in and the bolt falls closed with a clunk. Well, that one obviously is not dragging inside the chamber and has plenty of head clearance. Let's pull that one out and put the next one in. The next one does not fall closed. As a matter of fact, I have to put just a slight amount of pressure with my thumb on it to get it to go all the way closed. And it drags all the way down. That one, my friends, fits the chamber virtually perfectly. It's probably just an ever so slight amount longer than the chamber, but such a small amount that it's not going to make any difference in our sizing process. We're going to put this one aside in a different spot so that we don't get it mixed up with the others. Let's try that third piece of brass. The third piece of brass goes in and falls closed again. So let's get out our comparator and measure the 3 pieces of brass and see what we got for dimensions. Well, the first one is 1.455. Next one's 1.456. About 1,000ths longer. Now, these were both fired in the same chamber with the same load on the same day during practice. And they're 1,000ths different. Keep an eye on that because it's about to get really interesting. The one that drug in the chamber is 1.458. Now, that one is just a touch longer than the other 2. I already have a 3,000th spread in my case dimensions from cases that were fired in the same rifle. That is one of the problems with fireforming brass. You are not going to get a super consistent case dimension after that first firing, no matter how hot your load is, unless you went so hot that you destroyed your brass, in which case you really don't care, you're going to need new brass anyway. Let's take a look at what happens if all 3 of them were to just simply fall closed. In that case, we're going to have to put a little shim into the system. I like to use just simple 3M Scotch tape. It's about 1.5 to 2,000ths thick. Put a little bit on the back of the case head, trim it around so it doesn't get past the rim, and chamber with it. Now, if the bolt now drags closed, you know that you're at that full dimension. You can measure it and you have a measurement to work from. Now, I will forewarn you that I do have a headspace gauge here that I used to set the headspace on this particular barrel when I put it on because it's a nut barrel. And that headspace gauge is 1.457. In other words, the headspace of the chamber as installed is approximately 3/4 to 1,000ths of an inch longer than the go gauge is, which is just about perfect. You want the go gauge to fall closed, and you want the no-go gauge to not even start closing, which is the case. I've run both go and no-go on this chamber, and it's all good. So now that we have an idea of what dimension is going to have a little drag on the bolt when we close it at 1.458, we're going to use that as the basis for our sizing. How do we do that? What we're going to do is we're going to say our target is 1.456. Well, we have one case that's already at 1.456, and we have one case that's longer than that, one case that's shorter. So we're going to set up our die from there. Now, this is a Redding factory simple standard one-piece die. This is not magic. And I'm using the expander in it. Yes, you heard me. I'm using the expander ball. And I'm sure somebody's out there wringing their hands. Well, what about an expander mandrel? What about this? And what about... Don't worry about it. I can show you later how simply this works and works well for this application. It may not be perfect for all applications, probably not ideal for F-class where we would want to use a mandrel so we can control neck tension effectively. But for this, it works just fine. I'm also using a set of Redding competition shell holders. The reason I use these is because they make my life very, very simple. I don't have to screw the die up and down, use shims, use click adjustments, or any of that other garbage. I take the die, I screw it in until it touches the top of the shell holder, screw it down a little more so I get a good over center on the press, and that's where the die sits for the entire time. I simply change the shell holders to get the right amount of sizing. In this case, I'm using the 10,000ths oversized shell holder, which is the biggest one, to get the sizing just right from the beginning. So we start at the 10,000th shell holder and we size that first oversized case and it comes back to 1.455, pretty much right where we want it. Right about 2.5 pushed back from the shoulder of the chamber. This will work fine. Now we got to create consistency in our sizing process. This is where we're going to have some issues with once fired brass. It's really important that you understand this. When you're sizing once fired brass, there will be pieces of brass that are significantly shorter than your desired end state. Squeezing the sides of the brass in with the sizing die is going to lengthen it a little bit, but may not lengthen it enough to make it fit completely to your desired dimension. So after sizing once fired brass the first time, you're going to need to sort them. That's what the comparator is for. Sort the brass and make sure that you have control of the dimensions. So you're shooting it in groups that are at least similar for head clearance dimension. That way you can do your load development, you can shoot matches and things like that without getting surprise flyers. All right, guys, so before I start sizing this whole batch of brass, I'm going to do something that is absolutely unnecessary. Listen to me, this is not necessary. A lot of top-level F-class shooters don't do this at all. But I do because I've done it all along. I'm going to anneal the brass. And this takes time. This is a lot of handling of brass, and honestly, maybe a waste of time in this application, but I just do it anyway because I have time on my hands. So once the brass is all annealed, it is time to start sizing. I lube it up with a little bit of Dillon spray lube in a Ziploc bag. Shake it around real good, get the lube all over it, toss it in a bin, let it dry, because you gotta let the alcohol flash off. Once alcohol's gone, it's time to size all this brass, and I'm just gonna run it through the die. So after I've cycled all the brass through, it is time to trim them all up. Now I'm gonna use a Gerard because I already have one. If I didn't, I would trim it with whatever I had. It's not critical. And last but not least, I clean the primer pockets. Yes, I clean primer pockets every single time. I have not uniformed these and don't have any intention to do so. Now that I have it all done, it's time to sort this brass and figure out what the dimensions of the cases are so that I can sort them by head clearance for this barrel. It's not a big deal, and the vast majority of them fall right there at that exact 0.002 line where we wanted them. So we're going to have the majority of what we need right there. We're going to have some that are a little different, and we're just going to shoot those as either Fowlers or test rounds. So guys, in order to get that brass up to competition standards after fireforming, you're going to have to pay attention to what your chamber is telling you. No matter what you do, after you've sized a piece or two of brass, try it in that chamber again while you still have the bolts apart to make sure it chambers easily. You're looking for the bolt handle to fall closed with a minimum amount of clearance, because ultimately, minimizing the amount that the case moves forward when the firing pin strikes the primer is beneficial to improving your ignition quality, precision, and velocity spreads. All right, guys, until next time, shoot straight, get that brass sized right, and I'll see you in the next video.